Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation and opportunity to present and share some thoughts and reflections on the Transparency Act. It has implications for us, for other financial institutions that fall within the scope of the law. In DMB, I work as a senior sustainability advisor in the ESG section within the corporate banking area. That entails many things, among them providing assistance to client managers in identifying, assessing and mitigating ESG risks that we are exposed to through our lending activities. I also head the Equator Principles committee in DMB, which is an advisory committee set up to ensure compliance with the environmental and social risk framework. In 10 minutes, it's a tall order to cover much, but I will try to touch on these two issues. Yes, as has been explained by many of the other presenters, banks and financial institutions are indeed within the scope of the law if they meet the threshold criteria of the Act, and there's no exemption for financial institutions. It then follows from Section 4 of the Act that due diligence of our suppliers and business partners shall be performed according to the OECD guidelines. And as this illustration shows, and I think also touched upon by and showed by Crystal and Katrin, there has been developed also some separate sector guidelines for the financial institutions. One for corporate lending and securities underwriting, and one for institutional investors. However, there are some differences between the Act and the OECD sector guidelines. And this has triggered some public debate in Norway about what obligations the financial institutions should have in relation to our customers. Because while the OECD sector guidelines quite clearly defines business relationships as a financial institution's clients and investee companies, the definition of supply chains and business partners in the Transparency Act are more narrow, focusing on the suppliers of input factors to our production of products and services. And in our opinion, this may indicate that clients and investee companies are not, on a general basis at least, meant to be included in a bank's duties under the law. However, we look forward to more clearance from the Consumer Authority and Nadia on this going forward. With regards to risk themes, we also see that the sector guidances is intended to guide financial institutions on how to follow the guidelines on adverse impacts stemming from the full sets of responsible business conduct risk themes. However, as pointed also out from some of the prior presenters, the Transparency Act scope is now on human rights and decent working conditions only. On the materiality side, the sector guidances require due diligence to be performed on any clients where there are actual or potential adverse impacts. But under the Transparency Act, this is only the material contributions that the bank or investment firms to human rights violations are performed by the clients that qualifies for actions by the bank or investment firm. So lesser or trivial contributions may be excluded. That's at least how we have interpreted the law so far. Irrespectively of how the Transparency Act may be interpreted with regard to obligations, the OECD guidelines have for many years been used in DMB as a basis for how we perform our due diligence and engagement with clients. It is referred to in the top documents in our ESG governance structure, the Group Principles on Corporate Responsibility. But it's also listed as a requirement in a group standard on corporate responsibility and credit activities. And also we have embedded these requirements in our KYC and credit processes. So just to give you a couple of examples of how our current Transparency Act related documents look like today. And yes, absolutely, we are in the process of revising this as a consequence of the Act, of course. But as you can see, we have already embedded some compliance with laws and regulations in the requirements, both towards our business partners and our corporate customers. We also assess ESG risks of clients by means of a risk assessment tool. This is also something you will find in the sustainability library of DMB on the internet. That is an assessment we have based on Sustainalytics methodology, covering material topics within both climate, environmental, social, and governance. Here we've just shown an excerpt of the social related themes that we detect and map. So if we see any gaps or red flags arising from this assessment, we always engage in a dialogue with an aim to reduce or mitigate the ESG related risks. And if we see that matters are not satisfactorily resolved or improved after continued dialogue, we may take steps actually to disengage from a client relationship. That is, of course, not what we aim at for and want at all. But in seldom circumstances, we have actually done that in the past. And also, it's important to say that increasingly we embed ESG-related covenants in our loan agreements to ensure that we have satisfactory leverage and a handle to pull if needed. So what can the Act's right to information imply for banks? I think it's been touched upon also by prior presenters. It will actually, we believe, represent increased reputation risks for all companies, clearly also for banks. If information of what banks has financed a controversial project or a controversial client is known. So we expect that we may well become the target of focus from journalists wanting to understand what due diligence performance we have performed on clients and projects. So this is something we actually can expect. Hopefully we have done our work and also that the clients act responsibly, but this cannot be ruled out. And as you see from this illustration, Norwegian Association of Journalists are really welcoming this law and sees it as an effort to really have more power and to apply pressure on companies within the scope of the law. Yes, right to information also has another angle, and that means that we and other companies must be very good at communicating how we respect human rights and how we comply with the Transparency Act. And that will be very key for the effective response to the right to information from stakeholders. Not only from media and journalists, but also from NGOs and analysts. We see this probably arising and increasing. We've also seen already actually an uptick in the requests from our clients that reach out to us to ensure that we, as a supplier or business partner to them, can document that we have the measures in place to comply with the law. And of course, we can't deal with every request individually. We need to have some common information that we can point to, and that's why we need to do a revamp on how we communicate this. Lastly, I thought I would just give a few comments on some regional issues and trends that we have noticed. Again, probably covered a bit from some of the others here. However, over the last several years, we've seen companies, consumers, and governments turning their attention to ESG matters. And what used to be a race to the top for companies to voluntarily disclose their processes, progress and targets resulted in a variety of disclosure choices, both in style and content. Calls for accountability and consistency have led governance around the world to increasingly consider and pass laws requiring companies to make disclosures according to specific rules. In particular, there has been an uptick in mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, of course, as witnessed in this act, but also in similar acts in France, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, UK, California, and most recently the EU. But yeah, this is actually about staying competitive and also to secure financing. So all companies must be aware of these mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. And in the Asia and Pacific region, of course, we have the home of many of the world's supply chains, and they are highly exposed to this trend. So even if a company is not subject to a particular mandatory human rights due diligence law, such legislation will likely impact the company's due diligence because of the cross-jurisdictional nature of supply chains. So therefore, to stay competitive and relevant to buyer markets, companies acting as suppliers and business partners should be aware of this trend and the expectations therein. Lastly, human rights is not a new concept to Asian countries. There has been some debate on whether human rights is a Western concept. Clearly, this is wrong, at least as I see it. Human rights are fundamental and universal, representing nothing new for Asian countries. They have long been nurtured and cherished by Asian societies, and there are also strong religious and social backing for that. Asian countries are also taking initial steps towards possible mandatory human rights due diligence legislations, and during the summer of 2021, the Japanese government began a large-scale investigation to understand human rights issues in the supply chains of Japanese companies, including their indirect suppliers. So based on the findings, the government will then discuss whether these rules will lead to a legislation. Yeah, lastly, just an observation, because last week I attended the Equator Principles mid-year workshop days in Copenhagen, and we were told of a very important and happy trend. The members of the Equator Principle group of banks are increasing, and new joiners in 2022 has all come from the Asian region, leading to the Asian region and Asian Oceania being the largest group of banks within the association. So, and as you may not be very familiar with that institution or that association, as an Equator Principle financial institutions, you have to commit to decline financing requests of projects that does not meet these principles. And we also, as EPFIs, commit to fulfill our responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN guiding principles and carry out human rights due diligence. So yeah, to see such a strong growth in commitment from Asian banks is promising and bodes well for the future. I think that's all I had. I hope you have found something useful in this very short and high-level presentation. And many thanks for your attention.